Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and joining me once again is the brilliant, talented, and always entertaining Bill Nance. Hello, Bill.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Good to see you. For those of you who don't know Bill, he's been on our podcast many times. He also has a podcast, which I adore. I highly recommend it, A Confused Heap of Facts, which I'll have Bill tell you about in a minute, but he's a quick disclaimer for us.
As an employee of the United States Army Command General Staff College, all the opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are my own and do not represent the official position of the United States government, the Department of War, the Combined Arms Command, the Command and General Staff College, or the Command and General Staff School.
Got it. And before we get into the topic today, which is General Mark Clark, what is a Confused Heap of Facts podcast?
That's a podcast. We do it through the school, and it's just my friend and I, Dr. John Abel, where we've known each other since grad school. So it's kind of this weird thing of we're very different people, but we get along well. And we bring on other historians, generally from our department, but not exclusively. And it is a wide, eclectic, free-ranging conversation on whatever historical topic we come up. And what we try to do is, and when I say eclectic, it really truly is eclectic. We'll have an episode on the Civil War one day and World War II the next. We'll talk about leadership one day. We'll talk about darn near rivet counting on tanks on the other. And the idea being it's military historian with subject matter experts. And we just kind of geek out about history for an hour.
Yeah, what I like about it is it's different and fresh each topic. Looking back, episode 81 was U.S. presidents in wartime. Episode 79 was medieval C2, which I loved. And then, reassessing General Meade from the Civil War. Just really interesting topics.
Yeah, as I said, eclectic. If you like military history, you will find an episode that appeals to you.
All right. Well, speaking of eclectic, you and I were talking before we came on about General Mark Clark, who, for those of you who don't know, he kind of directed the Allied invasion of Italy and the work Up the Boot. And I've seen a couple of reviews on this guy. It's kind of like a movie where everyone has different opinions. He's either an untalented general that had no idea what he was doing, or he was a good general who just had a hard task. What's your overview of Mark Clark?
A little from column A, a little from column B. As somebody that claims Texas as a home state, I am contractually obligated to have at least some disdain for the man. We'll talk about why that is, but short answer is the 36th Infantry Division, Texas Army National Guard at the Rapido. He's a complex individual, right? There are a lot of things that he did well. You don't get to be a four-star general without doing a couple things right. But he also had his share of mistakes. And that's one of the interesting things about history is you deal with people that are not archetypes, right? You deal with people that kind of fall into some greater scheme. It's why I generally veer away from the top, he falls at number 5 on our list of greatest generals in World War II. I don't like that kind of list because it doesn't quite make sense. You have to kind of deal with everybody on their own individual basis. Clark's not one of my favorites, if that makes sense. But yeah, he had some good qualities. He had some bad qualities.
Yeah, he's controversial for sure. Yeah, let's dive into his story. He was born May 1st, 1896 at Madison Barracks, New York, into a military family, if you couldn't tell from the barracks. Was he always destined to go in the Army, or did he want to do something else?
I don't know too much about his early life in terms of that. I mean, I will tell you that I was a military brat, and I spent 20 years in the military. It's one of those cases of being a military brat certainly does it exposes you to it. And particularly in the early 20th century, because let's be honest, when he was 4 years old, he was probably not thinking about what he was going to do when he grew up. The United States military was not on everybody's mind. In fact, if anybody was talking about the military, for the most part, like the general populace, it was actually the United States Navy. Because this is the era of T.R. Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, all that kind of popular navalism, all that kind of stuff was going on. The Army was kind of out on the frontier, handling the very last remnants of the Native American wars. There was fighting going on in the Philippines that was a little bit mentioned. But being in a military family, he's exposed to it. He understands the lifestyle. Something about it probably appealed to him because we see him make it his own. And to me, it's always more interesting the people that come from outside the military that choose to make the military lifestyle their own, rather than somebody that kind of grew up in it and that's what they know.
Yeah, for sure. He enters U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1913, graduates in 1917. Why is that graduation year significant, and what nickname did he have at West Point?
Okay, so I actually found two nicknames for him. The first was Opie, which I'm not quite sure the genesis of that one, but it probably had some. He may have had a goofy expression on his face. The one that's a little bit more famous, perhaps, is Contraband, and he picked that one up because rules at West Point have varied over the years. But typically, when he was going through, you're not allowed to keep a bunch of snacks and other assorted items of food in your room. He would be that person that would go out of his way to find ways to make that happen. So he would sneak stuff into his room and all that kind of stuff. So it was obviously well known amongst his fellows that became a nickname that he picked up. On the second part of your question of why 17 was significant, a couple of reasons. The dates here are interesting. So the United States entered the First World War on the 6th of April, 1917. His class, which was due to graduate in the first week of June anyways, but he was graduated on the 20th of April, 1917, because the Army needed lieutenants, and it needed lieutenants now. So that's actually a pretty rapid turnaround when you think about it. Now, the Army kind of had some advance warning that was going to happen, so they were probably able to lean forward in the saddle a little bit. But so yes, his class graduated early. Interesting fun fact, the class of 1918, so the guys that were juniors were graduated in August of that year. So typically in some West Point histories, you'll see the class of April 1917 and the class of August 1917. He was in the first one.
Okay.
He graduated, what is that, 2-3 months earlier, whereas the class of 1917 graduated a full year earlier, or class of 1918 graduated a full year earlier.
Well, after graduating, he was commissioned second lieutenant, U.S. Army Infantry. So what responsibilities would a newly commissioned officer have during this time?
Okay, so interesting enough, the Army's blowing up during 1917. It goes from a very small, basically frontier constabulary to all of a sudden, oh my goodness, we now need to create an army from scratch. And this is actually hard to do. Now, what was interesting to me is that Clark actually did not get the full advantage of, say, if he graduated a year or two earlier. As if, for instance, the class of 1909, famous group, Simpson, Patton, J. Seachley, all these guys that were first lieutenants during this time frame are going to very rapidly explode in careers. Like Simpson ends as a lieutenant colonel or a lieutenant colonel, by 1919. Clark's, he's just showing up there. So his responsibilities are, he is a trained officer. So he's going to go be a platoon leader, and he's going to get his platoon ready to go. It looks like he went to the 11th Infantry Regiment, which is a regular Army unit. So he probably had some draftees that filled in those ranks and whatnot to get them up to speed. But he was not in the case of putting all the brand new standing up units for rapid advancement. So his job was making sure a platoon could operate battle drills and all that kind of stuff. So that's what he's doing during this time frame.
Okay. Can you walk us through his World War I service?
Okay, so started as a platoon leader and worked up.
In France. Yeah.
In France. And then he was part of the 5th Division during that time frame. Interesting side note, this is when the United States Army is standing divisions. That had not actually been a thing up until this point. So this is why it's not the 5th Infantry Division, by the way. It's the 5th Division. Yeah, it's the red diamond patch. And he is kind of doing normal standard things. Gets promoted a little bit. I think gets up to about captain. His battalion commander falls sick. By this point, because he is a trained officer, which the U.S. Army is short of, because, again, you have to expand rapidly. So the way the Army would do this is we created the regular Army. So that's the Army that Congress authorizes. And then you have the Army of the United States. And the idea being is that you can get a commission rapidly in that because You just need that. And so he gets he gets commissioned fairly rapidly, rises up, and by this point he's a second, third rank in the battalion. Because again, he's one of the few regular Army officers there. They're having to pull in new folks there. His battalion commander gets sick. He gets to be the battalion commander, and it's kind of funny, battalion commander for a day. Gets wounded pretty early on in the fighting. They're fighting in the Vosges Mountains. This is even before the Saint-Mihiel offensive. This is before the Meuse-Argonne. So he's taken out of the fight pretty quickly. He rehabilitates fairly rapidly, but he's not put back in the front line. So he ends up spending a lot of the rest of the time kind of in the rear echelon, doing sustainment, doing planning, doing all that kind of stuff. So there's no real grand heroic stories of Mark Clark in World War I. It's basically, he was kind of a standard regular Army officer, took a piece of shrapnel, not uncommon, and recovered and then did staff work.
Yeah, but I wonder, like, if he was, when he went into West Point in 1913, obviously trench warfare and this horrific World War I hadn't started yet. So I wonder if he got to the lines 4 years later and was like, well, this isn't what I learned in college.
A common occurrence from that time frame. But yeah, it's kind of learning as you go. It was a formative experience for him in that it's kind of the first exposure. It's like he gets a deployment pretty early on in his career, right? Which is way to do it. I mean, OAF 1 was my first field problem, so I can kind of sympathize there.
Yeah.
Where he's just kind of putting his feet on the ground at the same time he's also in a combat zone. So he kind of gets that feel for it. He gets a little bit of feel for combat. He gets a little bit of feel for staff work, so he's a little bit more well-rounded perhaps than some folks that just spent their time on the line.
Yeah.
But it's one of those cases, he's not a Douglas MacArthur that gets a distinguished service cross for strolling across no man's land with a scarf and a cane or something. Or Patton, who gets wounded, because his tank breaks down and has to, decides to, go forward on foot. There's none of this going on there for Mark Clark. He is very much a Mark I vanilla officer.
Well, during the interwar years, he attended advanced military schools, including yours, the Command and General Staff School. And you and I were talking earlier, why is professional military education and continuing education important for future commanders?
Well, the days of just picking up a sword and saying, follow me, boys, if they ever existed, and I have a friend of mine who is a medievalist, Dr. John Hosser, great dude, who would dispute that has ever simply been the case. There's so much more to warfare beyond just charging right at the enemy or even the hook and jab. Okay, but there's the fix, the flank, the tactics that come with it.
Enfilade and defilade and all that, yeah.
But the idea being is that one of the School for Application of Infantry and Cavalry, which is what my school was originally called, and the later on what became the Command and General Staff School. The idea being, and the Prussians kind of pioneered this idea, there's 1,000,001 details that go into putting a large group of soldiers into the field, sustaining them, managing them, controlling them, and also then fighting them. And you have to learn that someplace. In the early modern era, you learned at the knee of your father. A good mutual friend of ours, Dr. John Abel, will tell you, this is how the nobles in France learned. That was their duty, was to die for France. And the sons learned at the knee of their father. All of these details. So as things get more complex, railroads, telegraph, on and on and on, the idea being is that there's a lot of detail work that goes into that. So if you don't have that, you can learn it. And some people can pick it up on the go, and that's fine, and we love those people, but you still need a solid cadre. And even the people that just kind of get it, it's better for them to have spent some time kind of walking through, learning it, learning how the system actually works. Because talent only takes you so far, and then you actually need you need to run drills, right?
Yeah, and along with that, you need something else. General George Marshall recognized Mark Clark's talent and helped advance his career. So how important is mentorship in a person's success, especially in the military?
Huge. And I would say that this kind of goes, you can talk about the business aspect of this, but I would assume that this is true really across life. In the Army of the interwar era, promotion was done based off of seniority, meaning your class rank at West Point, for the most part, dictated where you were within your own particular year group. But then your year group, you just kind of had to wait for someone to die or retire for a slot to open up so you could get promoted. And then it was literally next man on the list. But in the interim, you had good jobs and bad jobs. And you could get jobs where you could learn things. You could get schooling where you could learn things and get exposure to things so that when you got into those new roles through seniority, you could do something with it. And this is why you see, and then when war comes and we all of a sudden need to promote a vast number of people quickly, I talked about the Army of the United States. At that point, the rules of seniority are followed, but they turn into more of the Pirates Code, more of a guideline. There's a reason why Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel in 1939 and was a 5-star general in 1945. And what that is that you come to the attention of the people who are making these decisions. So when the strictures are loosened, they sit there like, no, this is the guy you want. I worked with him. He's solid. He's good. And everyone's kind of has their patron to a degree or another. And if nothing else, it's the coaching and the mentoring. I mean, this is true even today, right? You have the people that it's like, hey, boss, what do you think? Is this a good job? Is this a bad job? All of these things come into play in terms of how to handle yourself, what job you want next, how to make yourself better and more prepared for the next job. I mean, everybody that's anybody, you can kind of look back on it. The John J. Pershing crowd, the Peyton March crowd, they were kind of two different camps of the post-World War I group. But you come to the attention of George C. Marshall, all that kind of stuff. His famous Black Book, which actually physically never existed. But yeah, you come to the attention of the folks so that they keep putting you in, as we call, opportunities to excel.
Yeah, no, George C. Marshall is one of the best. So that was good for Clark. And by World War II, he's a general. So I want to talk about Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Why was Operation Torch important to the Allied war effort?
When the United States entered the war in December 41, the Americans had been planning for a two-front war actually since, pick your time frame, the 20s, the 30s. It started out with the color plans. Warplane black was for the Germans. Warplane orange was for the Japanese. And when we showed up, we're like, hey, Britain, let's ready to go. Let's cross the channel and fight those Germans in France. And the Brits kind of looked at you and said, you and what army? Which is fair enough, because at that point we were still standing up our army. No, we'd had the peacetime draft and we were mobilizing, but we were not ready to go. And there's a lot of back and forth as to where we're going to end up fighting. And Operation Torch was kind of it was a British plan for the most part that FDR acquiesced to. Marshall was not a huge fan. And it was a case of, it did a lot of things for us. Strategically, it put the Axis forces, the Germans and the Italians in North Africa, onto the horns of a dilemma, because they were fighting the British in Egypt at the time, well, Libya and Egypt. Then by landing in French North Africa, it would be, now all of a sudden they have to fight on two separate fronts, and we could kind of put them in a vise there. Additionally, it also served as a learning ground for what we call joint forcible entry today. How does one land a large group of soldiers and equipment on a hostile shore without destroying yourself? It's harder than it sounds. Think of like moving, and you have to bring all your things, but now you're doing it on a boat and you're landing on a beach and people are shooting at you. It's not just like that one, like you jump off a boat and call it good, because apparently people like to eat every day. You have to have a resupply. Something as simple as water. Water is very bulky and heavy. So we're learning all of these things. Also, it is kind of the proving ground for the alliance. The British and the Americans have been talking quite a bit, but talking and actually doing are two very, very different things. So if you've ever played a sport or something like that, you can sit down and you can sit in the room and draw the X's and the O's or whatever it is you can do and talk all the drills. But at a certain point, you have to get on the pitch or the playing field and actually do it. And at that point, what was it? It's the forming, storming, and norming group dynamics. North Africa was what we would call the storming phase of that process, where the British and the Americans are really kind of figuring out what that looks like. And the Brits are not very complimentary to the American fighting man at first. They call the Americans our Italians, which is not complimentary to either the Americans or the Italians. It's kind of unfair to both, in my opinion. But we were learning, we were growing. And when people are dying, tensions get heightened.
Yeah.
And where Clark fits into this is that you talked about mentorship, right? He'd come to the attention of the right people. He was in the right place to help with the planning. In fact, he is actually put ashore ahead of time to do some of the negotiations. A lot of these early generals, the reason they're there is because they had been, going back to that previous question, they had been exposed to, and the right people, the senior leaders, where they were like, this is the guy I want. This is what we're doing there. So Mark Clark is helping with the planning, the execution, and kind of getting to know some of the people on the ground there.
Well, later in 1942, he's appointed commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, which is about 200 to 300,000 troops. So what challenges come with commanding an entire field army?
It is a huge organizational challenge, particularly in World War II. The way a field army was set up is that it was both an administrative and a tactical headquarters. And a tactical headquarters, one can quite figure reasonably, they're giving tactical orders, right? Hook and jab. Bear in mind, the United States Army did not have the operational level of war at that time frame, so it was tactical, strategic. Everything on the battlefield or close to the battlefield was tactical. Anything not on the battlefield was kind of strategic. There are other lines, but that's good enough for our purposes. But administrative headquarters administration in World War II was not just evaluation reports, human resources kind of stuff. It was all the sustainment, the management, all the things that we call logistics, all of that stuff encompassed there. So his job was not just to win on a battlefield. In point of fact, that's not really his primary role. That's actually a corps commander or division commander's role. His job was making sure this whole couple 100,000 man force is functioning properly. So a division commander might be like a middle manager. A corps commander, one might refer to as like a project manager or maybe like a vice president. But an army commander, we're more in the CEO realm, if that makes sense. They've got their hands on all the levers, and that's why the army staff is there to help him do all of that stuff. So it's not just fighting battles, it's not just sustainment, it's both combined together, managing all that.
Yeah, I kind of think about like a head coach of a football team. Like, yeah, you're the head coach, but you have a defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, you have wide receivers coach, you have all these other, trainer. You're just kind of orchestrating all that stuff.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Well, let's get into the main part of his career. The Allied invasion of Italy of 1943. Why was Italy considered an important front in World War II, and what was the strategy here?
I might say something a little controversial here, but Italy really wasn't an important front of World War II. It was a useful front of World War II. If anybody's seen Southern Europe, and there's a lot of mountains there. This gets at a fundamental strategic disconnect between the Americans and the British. The British wanted to fight. There's a couple things going on here in the British strategy. One is the British strategy, which goes all the way back to, one could argue, the Napoleonic era, which is a war on the periphery, which is the Brits do not have large land forces. And bear in mind that in 1942 and 1943, neither did the Americans. We're getting there, but they're not built yet. So it's a peripheral strategy. There are army groups fighting on the Soviet front. Groups of armies, if you can think about that. In 1943, we have, between the two of us, between the Americans and the British, one big army group or two small ones, depending on how you want to do the math there. One small American army and two British armies. That's kind of it. So the British are looking for a peripheral strategy to kind of keep the Germans engaged, kind of keep pecking at them, and all that other kind of stuff. The other thing that's going on is Churchill has many faults, but he does understand grand strategy quite well. He does understand that Stalin is probably going to come west at some point. When that happens, he would like to contain the communists as much as humanly possible. So he is looking at the Balkans not for its value in fighting the Germans, but it's for its value in containing a future Soviet Union, which sort of tracks. The problem is the Americans are sitting there going, dude, that's great, but we kind of have this war to fight. If we fritter away all of our resources fighting over there, we're never going to win this war. Or if we win this war, and we're also going to kind of tick off the Soviets in the same process there. So that's what's going on with the Mediterranean strategy. But they got torched. They finished Tunisia.
Got Sicily.
At Casablanca, they decide they're going to go to Sicily. And then operation specified later. Well, the Americans are thinking France. Churchill and company then go, well, we're already in Sicily. Italy's right there. So then it's kind of like this game theory thing going on, right? You've already bought, you've kind of bought the first half. Now buy the second half, right? So going into southern Italy makes sense. The Foggia airfields, which are the big city there is actually Bari, if you're trying to find it on a map. It's kind of that little bone spur that sticks out off the heel of Italy. Those are useful because you can put the 15th Air Force there. You can bomb the Ploesti airfields. That's a great place to be. Because remember, the summer of 43, the Soviets have finished the Battle of Kursk and they're headed points west. So they haven't taken out the Ploesti airfield. So that makes sense. But once the Italian government falls, what are you doing in Italy? Well, we're tying down German forces. Well, okay, cool. But do we have to do that at the expense of beating our heads into mountain fortresses repeatedly? So suffice it to say, southern Italy makes sense. The rest of the Italian campaign turns into, well, we're here. So we're causing attrition and we're keeping the Germans occupied. Never mind the fact that we're also causing attrition on ourselves and keeping an entire army group of Allied forces engaged. Bear in mind that eventually becomes Americans, Brits, Poles, Brazilians, French, Canadians. Italy truly is the multinational force there. But that was kind of a long way around of saying Italy is useful at first, but becomes steadily less useful, particularly because the Italian government falls and actually switches sides as we invade Salerno.
Yeah, we land in Salerno. Mark Clark and his forces do September 1943 and establish a foothold in mainland Italy. We've already talked about the difficulties of amphibious landings. How did the invasion go at first?
Well, Salerno itself was a pretty near-run thing. The Germans had kind of been expecting it. There's only so many places that make sense to land. And Salerno, quite frankly, is the bleedingly obvious choice. It's a huge beach within range of Allied air cover from Sicily, which is important. It's close enough to mainland ports. There's lots of reasons why Salerno makes a lot of sense. But because it makes a lot of sense, the Germans were as prepared for it as they possibly could be. Montgomery's actually going to come up through the toe of Italy as well, but which takes a fair amount of time to do. But yeah, so Salerno is a bloody, closely fought, hard-run affair. Depending on your sympathies to Mark Clark, you could say that because he was the one leading the offensive, there was a British Corps involved as well, but he was the army commander, is that he handled it magnificently and was out there, and his personal leadership helped stabilize the front. You could argue that some of his choices made things worse. There's partisans on both sides of that argument. I personally think that, he fought that. There's the acid test, right? It succeeded, right? So he fought Salerno pretty well.
And he works his way up and, what is it? September to June, what is that? So 9 months later, Clark's troops enter Rome, making it the first Axis capital to be liberated. But was this just a symbolic victory, and was it a smart tactical move in the overall scheme of fighting the Germans?
Interestingly enough, it's yes, it was the first Axis capital to be liberated from the Germans. Of course, by June of 44, it was either the capital of a non-belligerent or a co-belligerent, depending on how you view the government of King Emmanuel. So yes, Rome was important. Rome was significant. It's Rome, right? All roads lead to Rome. If you're Catholic, it's obviously a big deal. But in terms of the city itself, this goes back to what we were talking about before, right? What are we doing here, folks? Because the campaign getting to Rome, the Gustav line, Anzio, horribly bloody, horribly attritional. I mean, we basically chewed up multiple divisions, corps worth of people getting there, not to mention consuming vast amounts of resources in what by January of 44, actually, let's call it December of 43, had been dictated to be strategically a secondary theater. So in terms of getting to Rome, yes, it was important because we took Rome. Of course, Clark is very, very put out because he enters Rome and it's June 4th. And of course, famously, 2 days later is D-Day. So of course, D-Day gets all the press, and the Fifth Army's capture of Rome kind of is pushed to the bottom of the top, below the fold or the second page, right?
But you feel for the guy because he's probably getting criticized, like, why is this taking so long? And then he finally captures something important, and then he gets criticized for that.
Well, yeah, of course. It's like, yes, he's being criticized for being slow going up there, but Clark fought the war he was given, which is he was told to crack the Gustav line. So, by God, he certainly tried and eventually did. One could argue it was Alexander's plan, and you're not entirely wrong there. But when he did get to Rome, the name of the game in Italy, and there's only one game in Italy by June of 44, and that is kill Germans, and kill more Germans. But the idea being is that the city itself was functionally meaningless. And because he was more focused on taking Rome as opposed to trying to cut off the German 10th Army, which is where the controversy comes into play, is he didn't ascribe to that role. So the idea being there is that, yeah, that's a problem. Alternatively, you could sit there and argue, well, at least there was a morale victory of capturing Rome, which of course was immediately subsumed by the fact that there was the invasion of Northwest Europe a little bit later there.
Let's talk about his command style while we're on it. The art of command. How would you characterize his leadership style, and did he get along with his subordinates and the people above him and other Allied commanders?
It kind of depends on who you ask. Most of his subordinates would universally agree that his army headquarters was a very service-oriented headquarters. In other words, if you were a subordinate and you came up and asked for help, you were going to get help. That's a good thing in a senior headquarters. I like it. A lot of subordinates seem to kind of get some people call it kind of a slimy feel, which is it was done more for how can we make the Fifth Army look good. Nothing wrong with making your headquarters look good, right? It's definitely better than making your headquarters look bad. Yeah, but the idea being is there is that line though between, is the headquarters doing this because it's the right thing to do, or are they doing this because how can we make ourselves look good? There is that line, right? Particularly when lives are on the line, right? And this is of course going to lead into a lot of his controversies. The Rapido River, which honestly probably not Mark Clark's entire fault there. Monte Cassino, really not. That one, you can blame him for a lot, but Monte Cassino we'll get to in a minute, but probably not his fault. Rome, almost entirely his fault. But it all came down to is when people talk about getting people killed or getting people hurt, you want to make sure it's because we're out there to win the war, not to make somebody look good. And there was that feel. He had a very rough relationship with the British. Now, a guy by the name of Sir Alan Brooke, who is the chief of the Imperial General Staff, didn't like him, which almost by definition is actually a good mark. You're known by your enemies, if that makes sense. Sir Alan Brooke hated everybody. Oh my God. He was not a fan of most of the American general officers of World War II. But suffice it to say, Sir Alan Brooke did not think Mark Clark was up to the job. Patton didn't really like him, though. Of course, Patton didn't get along. Devers, that's a little bit more damning because Devers is actually a guy that can get along with lots of folks. Didn't get along with him. Patch, not a huge fan. Yeah. So there's a little bit more going on here in terms of there's some personality conflicts going on there.
Okay, we'll come back to it in the legacy here. Okay. Let's talk about Monte Cassino. You brought it up, and the bombing of the historic abbey there. Very controversial. A lot of people question whether it was needed. Do you think it was necessary, and do you think Clark should take the blame, or his higher ups, or what happened here?
Yeah, this is one of those that you can blame Clark for a lot of things, but I don't really think this is one of them. If you want to go to Rome, you have to go past Monte Cassino. The end. Have a nice day. Without doing something really weird like going through Anzio and all that kind of stuff. And that worked out so well, right? The Germans have been very explicit about avoiding hanging out at the Abbey. The Americans knew they weren't at the Abbey. Interestingly enough, it wasn't the Americans that actually asked for it. It was actually the New Zealand Corps working for Fifth Army that asked to do this. It was a guy by the name of Bernard Freiberg. And it's a great observation post. It really is. But the New Zealand Corps had asked for the bombing of Cassino.
Well, if there's snipers up there or around there, you know, and you're trying to get past it.
Right. But what ended up happening is that the New Zealand Corps requested permission to bomb the casino. Clark said no. Freiberg bypassed Clark, went to Alexander, Field Marshal Alexander, commander at that time, 15th Army Group or the Allied forces in Italy. Take your pick on the term. And Alexander said, yeah, go ahead and do it. And then, of course, that led to the bombing, which then after it's destroyed, then it becomes a thing. So, in my opinion, the bombing of the Abbey was entirely unnecessary. Typically, we find a lot of using operational and strategic bombers for tactical effects had marginal effects. There are exceptions, Cobra being one. But for the most part, what you saw is that we weren't going to solve that problem that way. And in fact, we made the problem worse. And as evidenced by the fact that we bombed it in February and March, and we didn't get through there until June.
Yeah.
Or May.
Yeah. Well, World War II ends, and during the Korean War, Clark is appointed commander of United Nations forces in Korea in 1952. Can you tell us about his later career and the congressional inquiry on the Gari River debacle of World War II?
Okay, let's start at the end and work our way back. So the congressional inquiry in the Gari River, popularly known as the Rapido River crossing, is the veterans of the 36th Infantry Division were very, very upset about this. Interesting thing about the 36th Infantry Division is it was a National Guard division that was one of the first deployed over. Most of the later deploying Guard divisions lost their Guard character because of the influx of draftees. 36th had a Texas twang up until the Rapido River, where it took massive casualties. He had basically ordered the division to repeatedly assault the position, push the Corps commander well past what he was comfortable with. Congress cleared him of any wrongdoing. However, Clark didn't like to talk about it later. And quite rightfully so. And in Texas, people, I mean, my grandmother talked, kind of like Mark Clark kind of thing. And that was still a thing. I think it's kind of mostly gone now because of history has happened over the years. So the bottom line is that he probably made some bad choices with the Rapido crossing. There were other people to blame too, not just Clark. James Holland has a really good section on it in one of his books where he talks about that, where it's not just Clark's fault. But suffice it to say, Congress cleared him of it. So, but it's kind of the stain in his record. Yeah. His post-war career, he commanded occupation forces in Austria for a while, commanded a peacetime army, working training, mobilization, and strike breaking. After World War II, lots of labor unrest there. Kind of a standard kind of thing for what you would have for a four-star. Interestingly enough, yes, he commanded U.S. forces in Korea in 1952, but by that point, the war was kind of a battalion fight, regimental fight. Most of the serious offensive operations had already happened by that point, and defensive operations. So not really a whole... In other words, it's not like a Van Fleet or Ridgeway or something like that. He has a very successful career as a senior general, but it's not anything that people remember him for, if that follows.
Yeah, after retiring from the Army in 1953, he serves as president of the Citadel Military College from 54 to 65, and he dies in 1984 at the very old age of 87. So what is his legacy? Because there was that famous quote in the Patton movie where they're like, well, yeah, it's his guts and our blood, old blood and guts. So you can be an aggressive general and you're going to have deaths on your hands. But I guess if you have charisma, it's okay. Maybe Clark didn't have Patton's charisma.
Clark is this weird mix of comparing him to Patton's actually is a fair comparison in my opinion. It's not just his charisma, because he certainly had that. it's also he was in the wrong place to have that, if that makes sense, right? He gets the one shining moment at seizing Rome, but that is marred with controversy as well, right? He did the job that was laid out in front of him, because as much as I will criticize the Italian campaign after we hit the Gustav line, that wasn't entirely his call to sit there. Like, he's not going to call up Marshall and say, hey, boss, yeah, we're done. We're going to kind of just fix the German forces here, but I'm not going to lose lots of folks. That wasn't entirely his call to make. So he is known for this grinding, bloody fight in what is essentially a sideshow 6 months after he landed. He did reasonably well, but every time his name comes up there, there is a controversial side aspect to it, if that follows.
Well, is there terrain maybe should get more mention, because he's not going through the lowlands of the Netherlands or the fields of France. He's going over mountains and rigid. I mean, maybe Patton wouldn't have done as well going up the boot of Italy as he did.
We know that. And that's why I said, yeah, the comparison to Patton is very apt, is because with Patton, once Patton hit the Moselle River in the Metz campaign, it's a bloody hard slog too. I mean, the difference being is that in Italy, there's always one darn mountain after another. I mean, there's a reason why the Germans are not terribly worried about, they're worried a little bit about Italy. They're going to put some combat power down there, but they're like, you're going to continue to fight us down here? All right. Okay.
Yeah, you look at his legacy. I mean, the guy, served the army for how many years, fought in 3 major wars. So maybe he should get more credit than he does. I think he's just kind of for whatever reason, maligned.
He's maligned because he made hard choices, and some of those choices quite rightfully can be challenged, right? The Rapido being perhaps the number one there, being challenged for his conduct of the Italian campaign. There's some of the choices he made, and some of the things are, as you said, it's more of his circumstances. As we kind of started out, he's a complex character that is kind of interesting to study because he doesn't fit into that archetype. Digging more into Clark makes us question some of the things that make us like other generals, makes us maybe ask some of those harder questions. In other words, do we really like Patton because Patton was amazing, or because Patton was in a couple of the right theaters that was able to achieve success?
Yeah. But you look at Clark overall, I mean, yes, he captured Rome. Yes, he drove the Germans pretty much out of Italy, at least up into the northern part. So he did his job, maybe just not as fast as people would have liked.
Yeah, as I said, he's an interesting character. And then his command relationships, one could argue Patton and Bradley have the same relationships, but they were in the cooler theater.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Bill. Great stuff on Mark Clark. Again, you can find Bill on a great podcast, Confused Heap of Facts. Recommend checking that out. And we thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.